In this video, I'll show you how I make wooden signs like these using a Dremel. Our focus will be on getting the engraved lines as clean and crisp as possible. If you have ever tried freehand engraving with a Dremel, you know how tricky it can be to get clean lines. The change in grain and density of the wood can make it difficult to keep the bit steady. And usually I end up with something like this. Now, this is okay, but this is hard to sand and you kinda just have to feather it down to the surface to make it smooth. I want my signs to look cleaner than that. After some testing, I've figured out a process to get cleaner and more professional engravings using a Dremel, the workstation, and a few extra tools. Before we start, we need some letters or designs to engrave. One of my favorite ways to find great written designs is through Google Fonts. Just head over to fonts.google.com and you'll find tons of styles to choose from. I'm going to set the writing system to Latin and the style to fancy. And that is the look I'm going for in this project. Feel free to play around with these settings until you find a font that suits your sign. For this example, I'm using a font called Cookie. It's already installed on my computer from Google Fonts. If you need to install a font, just click Get Font, download it, open it up, and hit Install. Once it's installed, open up the document in Google Docs. Go to the Font menu, click More Fonts, and search for the one you just added. It should now be available to use. I will be engraving the word home, and I like to print it out in a few sizes to see what works best. Next, we need something to engrave onto. I like to use birch planks that I cut from firewood. I'll make a separate video soon on how to make these using basic tools. Some of these have started to decay and spalt, which creates these cool black lines running through the wood. You can also use basswood sheets from Amazon. They're easy to cut to size and work well for engraving. I will leave links to everything I use down in the description. You can engrave on almost any wood, but each type behaves differently. Birch is fairly soft, which makes it easy to shape and not too harsh on your tools. I've also tried this method on harder woods like oak, and it works like a charm. Harder woods tend to be tougher on tools and cutting edges, so we take more shallow passes when working with them. For this video, I'm going to use yew wood, which is actually a softwood, but it is denser than oak and it has a beautiful orange color to the wood. Here is a quick look at the main tools we'll be using. The flex shaft and the marking knife is optional, but they do make the process go by smoother. To transfer the design, I use carbon paper. Just tape the printed design onto the top of the wood. Then slide the carbon paper underneath with the carbon side facing down. Tape everything down well so it doesn't move while you're tracing. Now trace over the letters. Make sure not to miss any little pockets. I always seem to forget one. You can also simplify the design at this point. Tight curves and small pockets are harder to clean up later, so feel free to tweak the design to make things easier. For example, I'm going to simplify this part of the H and remove the links between the letters. This will save a lot of time during the sanding stage. When I removed the design, I had indeed missed the pocket in the H. But no worries, we can just fill that in with a pencil. Now that we're happy with the design, it's time to trace it with a sharp knife. You don't need anything fancy, just a basic utility knife will do. This step creates a crisp edge for the Dremel to carve against. Wood tends to flare up when engraving instead of being cut clean off, so cutting the line first helps prevent that by giving the wood a break point. But be sure to stay a tiny bit outside of the line. This leaves a margin for sanding later. This step is optional, some woods do not flare as much, and sharper cutting bits also helps to reduce it. Now we are ready to break out the Dremel. I'm using the 4250 with the workstation, but any decent rotary tool that fits will work. The workstation lets us cut at a consistent depth at a 90-degree angle. I made a separate video all about setting it up. Go check it out if you want more detail. At this stage, we're not focusing on precision, just removing the bulk of the material. I'm starting off with a flat surfacing bit. This one is from a cheap wood carving set I got on Amazon, and this one is from a set of aluminum cutting burrs. These work great because they actually cut the wood instead of just grinding it into dust. We'll work with shallow passes, starting with a bit about 1/25 to 1/12 of an inch below the wood surface. It depends on the wood and the bit how deep we can go. We can adjust the depth by using the lever at the back of the workstation. Make sure the black screw on the right side of the tool is tight. It stabilizes the Dremel. We also want to tighten this tiny brass screw. It is used to adjust the resistance of the lever. We won't be using the lever, so we want it as tight as possible. It removes some of the play in this tool holder. I run the tool at about 30,000 RPMs. Then just pass the wood back and forth, making sure to always keep the workpiece flat to the surface. Stay a little bit outside of the traced lines. We will do the detailing later. We are just removing material for now. We begin by cutting from the outer edge and steadily work toward the center in a calm, controlled manner. This helps prevent the bit from becoming trapped with wood on 3 sides. An unstable scenario that often leads to erratic performance when using such a large bit. Be careful with your fingers, especially near the edges. Even though the Dremel seems light, it can still cause serious injury. The bit can sometimes catch the wood and make a kickback. This one was triggered on purpose to show you. Using the left side of the bit seems more stable when cutting. The right side seems more sketchy and jumpy. So pass the material from left to right and let the left side of the bit do the cutting when possible. I only use the right side of the bit when I'm detailing and removing smaller amounts of material. Once we have removed the bulk of the material, we can do some rough detailing. Using this bit, we'll remove as much material as the design allows, right up to the lines we traced with carbon paper. Take care here, aim for clean, precise cuts along those lines to keep the edges smooth and minimize sanding later. Then reset the bit for a second pass. Just like before, but not as deep. I'm aiming for the engraved letters to stand out about 1/8 of an inch above the surrounding surface. A way to find a good depth without measuring is to just rest the bit onto the wood. Then tighten the lever at the back and pull the wood away from the bit. The Dremel drops about 1/25 of an inch when you remove the wood. Now we just repeat the process one more time to get those letters to pop a little bit more. This second pass can be a bit quicker since there's less material to remove. Once most of the material is gone, take your time and focus on cleaning up the edges. This will reduce the amount of sanding we have to do later. But don't worry if they're a little bit wavy and uneven. We will fix that with sanding. And now we should have something that looks like this. Now we have some smaller sections of wood to remove that this large cutting bit does not fit into. Swap to a smaller flat cutting bit. I use one from a cheap CNC engraver kit, but all of these types of cutting bits would work fine for this stage. We use the largest bit that will fit into the area without going past the line. Set the Dremel to about the same depth as the first pass when we remove the bulk of the material. We start by removing material away from the line and gradually work our way towards it. When we get close to the line, we remove material slowly, making sure that the line is as clean as possible. Dust will build up and reduce our vision when using these finer cutting bits. I like to use the Dremel 490 dust blower at this point. It blows away all the dust and the visibility is so much better. The 490 dust blower can cause some vibration in the tool with the bigger bits, but for smaller bits like this, it works really well. We will deal with these straight angles later. For the second pass, we need to do some finessing when setting the depth of the cutting bit. We want the bit to cut at the same depth as the surface surrounding the letters. To do this, we bring the bit down to the surface. Then we lift it up just a tiny bit. After we have tightened the lever and let go of the tool, the bit is going to drop a little bit and settle, just about 1/32 of an inch. We want to be able to move our workpiece freely with the cutting edges barely touching the surface. If the workpiece is hard to move and the bit gets stuck in the wood, the Dremel is set too deep. When starting the Dremel, make sure to push it up a little bit to counteract the downward force of hitting the start button. If not, it will leave a little mark in the wood. Now we just remove the material up to the line one more time. If the bit is still too large for some areas, we just swap to a smaller bit and do the same process one more time. Engraving pockets, like this part of the E, is a bit different since you're starting inside the letter. Start with the back lever loose. Start the Dremel while you keep a good grip on it and carefully lower the bit into the pocket to the wanted depth and lock it. I actually forgot to tighten the black screw here, so it went way deeper than I wanted. We used the same bit that we used for removing the smaller areas of wood between the letters and remove as much material as we can with this bit. We can get away with one pass for these pockets if we just work slowly. You can also use the depth stop on the workstation to set the same depth as the outside of the letters and then just make starting holes in all the pockets. This is probably the safest way, but it's a little bit more time consuming. This way you don't have to adjust the depth of the workstation while the tool is running and risk it dropping into the material. That would not be a good thing to happen. Don't worry if the pocket isn't the exact same depth as the outside of the letters. A small deviance will not be noticeable. We might have to go down in bit sizes one more time and repeat the process if there are even smaller areas where this bit is too big. And now we are finished with the rough shape of the letters. Since all Dremel bits are round, they are not very good at removing wood from sharp angles. To clean up tight corners, I like to use a small knife like this one and cut it out. We might have to pry out the material a little bit, so use one that does not break so easily. This one is a little bit too brittle, so I break the blade once in a while. This tiny chisel that I got in the same set also worked really well. I chipped the cutting edge on this one too. These tiny blades really does not like the hard yew wood. We can also use a pointy Dremel bit with a flex shaft or the stylo 2050 to remove some of the material that we cannot reach with the workstation method. Once you're happy with the outline, it's time for the key step that really cleans everything up, undercutting. For this, I use an inverted cone diamond burr to gently undercut the edges of the letters. The ones I use are called eye burrs. They're hollow in the center and have a gentle angle, which makes them great for this kind of work. But really, any inverted cone burr will do the job. Set your Dremel to the same depth as before. When you tighten the back lever, hold the bit just above the surface. This way, it'll settle flush once secured. I secured it a little bit too deep, but that's fine. We will just remove some material with this bit as well. Now carefully run the bit along the engraving, making sure not to let the shaft touch the edges of the letters. You'll also want to do this inside of the pockets of the letters. For those tighter spaces, we want to switch to a smaller bit. And the end product is some good undercut lines that will make it so much easier to keep the sanding sticks square to the engraved letters. To sand the letters, I like to use these sanding sticks that I made from popsicle sticks and sandpaper. I'll be making a video on how to make them soon, so keep an eye out for that. The sticks are shaped to match the contours of the letters. The two shapes I use the most are this tapered straight one, which is great for getting into tight corners and sanding flat surfaces. And also this curved one, which works really well for smoothing out curves like the inside of an O. First, I sand away the markings with some fine sandpaper so we can make out the lines better. When sanding, I try to keep the sanding stick at a 90-degree angle to the surface of the letter. This prevents you from accidentally rounding off the edges and creating a chamfered look. Now we're just sanding down the edges to remove any of the bumps and imperfections that are pretty common when using a Dremel to carve letters. We're still shaping the letters at this stage, so I'm using a rough grit durable sandpaper to speed things up. You can always go over everything with some finer grit at the end, but honestly, it's not essential. I like to sand one letter at a time instead of jumping around. It helps me feel like I'm actually making progress. The pockets can be a little bit tricky to sand, but try to use a sanding stick that matches the shape of the pocket. How long you spend sanding is totally up to you and how much of a perfectionist you are. I want my letters to look clean and crisp, but I'm not going to worry about every tiny imperfection. Once you're happy with how the letters look, we can shift our focus to the background. We have a couple of options for deciding what to do with the background. If we are tired of sanding, we can just texturize the background and call it a feature, like I did here with this oak. I think it looks pretty good. I used a round cutting bit for this one, but you can experiment with different bits and patterns on some scrap pieces of wood to find a design that you like. But since I love sanding so much, I'm going to sand the background to a smooth finish. This yew wood looks amazing when sanded. It is also very easy to sand. I start sanding and removing the larger imperfections with some rough grit sandpaper. Then I just work my way up to the finer grits. Sanding in between the letters is a little bit awkward, but with a combination of some sandpaper folded in different shapes and some custom-built sanding sticks, I was able to do it. This took me way longer than I would like to admit. Texturing is definitely the quicker option. To finish off the engraving, I'm going to put some linseed oil on the background. This will make the background a little bit darker, but it really brings out the grain of the wood. It is also going to soften the visible scratch marks that I was not able to sand to perfection. If you don't have linseed oil, you can just use normal cooking oil. I used it as a test for the inside of the O, and it looks almost identical. It is a bit risky because I don't know how it's gonna look, but I'm going to paint the letters white to give them some contrast to the dark background. We'll see how it works out. I think a bright stain would be better, but I only have dark ones. And here is the finished product. I think the white letters with the dark background turned out great. Thank you for watching the video. See you next time.